Pearl Harbor is disappearing behind a wall of smoke. Battleships burn in place, and men thrash in black, oil-slick water, shouting from between floating wreckage. USS Nevada can't stop for them. She's the only one with steam, just enough to move. Through the haze, the channel shows itself for a second. There's a thin, bright gap leading out to the open sea. Nevada turns for it. Then the bombs find her, and again and again. The ship keeps grinding forward anyway, her anti-aircraft fire stitching the smoke as more aircraft drop in. She's bleeding, slowing down. And this brings a bigger problem. If Nevada goes down where she stands, she'll seal the harbor shut, and the Pacific Fleet is trapped in port before the war has even begun. Ever since the British Royal Navy unveiled its HMS Dreadnought in 1906, the model had become the cool new toy around the block. It wasn't just that the ship was bigger than most vessels that had come before it, but also the fact that this was the first time naval designers had dared to say no thank you to medium-sized guns as main artillery, which, although not useless, was starting to get boring. Instead, they were now prioritizing an all-heavy, no-intermediate battery, made up of 10 12-inch guns, delivering an almost grotesque amount of power no nation had been able to master before. But it wasn't only this revolutionary firepower that made foreign officials shake in their boots when talking about HMS Dreadnought. The ship had also ditched conventional triple expansion engines in favor of steam turbines that pushed her to 21 knots while keeping a remarkably smooth sailing. Armed with power, speed, and enormous guns, HMS Dreadnought became the apex predator. If her captain wanted a ship gone, she could close the distance in a heartbeat and send an 850-pound projectile screaming across 16,500 yards, long before the enemy could bring its own guns to bear. If for any reason she wanted to instead skip a fight, she could simply turn away and vanish just as easily, allowing her to choose her battles on her own terms. The ship was so impressive that everything before her was suddenly obsolete. But across the ocean, another country was busy building one of the mightiest naval fleets in the world, one powerful enough that not even the fearsome Dreadnought could stand against it. Not to be outdone, the United States sought to put together a vessel that could one day pack as many as a dozen heavy guns across her decks. She would wield enough engine power to engage in long-range battles thousands of miles away from home, protected by a strategically placed armor scheme designed to ensure that she could take any amount of hits in combat. The one obstacle standing between the U.S. Navy and this dream battleship was Congress, which, despite approving the construction of an all-big gunship to counter the HMS Dreadnought, imposed strict limitations on the model's displacement, placing a hard cap at 16,000 tons, about 10% lighter than the British vessel. Naval commanders were not thrilled to realize their brand new ships would not even match their British rival in size. Still, a smaller ship was better than no ship at all, and even with these restrictions, the project carried on. The final result was a set of sisters, USS South Carolina and USS Michigan, both launched in mid-1908 and commissioned 2 years later. They couldn't quite deliver on the ambitious wish list the U.S. Navy Command had set for an American dreadnought, settling for 8 12-inch guns rather than the full dozen, and forced to use outdated triple expansion engines that could only manage about 18.5 knots, dooming the vessels to never be capable of outrunning their British rival. But for all those shortcomings, the sisters still managed to introduce one element HMS Dreadnought couldn't compete with: a better gun configuration. While the British battleship had her guns arranged in 3 centerline turrets, plus 2 wing turrets on the port and starboard sides, the American ships implemented a pure centerline super-firing system, with the turrets aligned and raised above one another. Even though HMS Dreadnought carried 2 more heavy guns, this configuration gave the U.S. ships a tighter, more efficient broadside. However, for the U.S. Navy, this advantage was not enough. They sought a ship that could definitively make HMS Dreadnought go out of style, and to do so, they had to take whatever worked from the South Carolina class and go back to the drawing board. As Britain descended into one of the worst armed conflicts the world had ever seen in 1914, its industrial capacity was pushed to the breaking point. New warships still rolled off the slipways, but the nation could no longer afford the constant, time-consuming refinements that had defined the pre-war dreadnought race. The path was now open for America to take the lead. However, Officials were likely still uneasy about pouring millions into an entirely new class of vessels, especially when the South Carolina class, while imperfect, was believed to be more than enough to keep the United States among the world's leading naval powers. Military leaders disagreed. Foreign powers were investing fortunes in dreadnoughts that grew more efficient and sophisticated with every passing year. If the U.S. didn't seize this moment, the glory of its Navy would soon become a distant memory. With little choice and mounting pressure, skeptical members of Congress swallowed their doubts and approved construction of the new Nevada class. USS Nevada, the first of the family, stretched 583 feet and carried a standard displacement of 27,500 tons, nearly 10,000 tons heavier than HMS Dreadnought, placing her among the largest battleships the United States had ever built. But it wasn't just her size that set USS Nevada apart. Her design introduced three major innovations that would mark a before and after moment in American naval engineering. The first was her engines. For the first time in U.S. history, a battleship was freed from the burdens of coal. Instead, Nevada ran on an oil-fired steam plant paired with geared turbines. In simple terms, this meant she was far easier to keep running and capable of crossing vast distances at nearly 21 knots without needing constant refueling. Second was her armor. Nevada was the first vessel to adopt the now famous all-or-nothing configuration. To eliminate unnecessary weight while still protecting vital systems, her main turrets, magazines, engines, and fire control stations were encased in armor up to 11 inches thick, while less critical areas were left virtually exposed. Finally, what truly made Nevada one of the most feared vessels afloat was her armament. Taking cues from the South Carolina class, she placed all her turrets on the center line, stacked front and back in super-firing positions. The raised turrets mounted twin 14-inch guns, while the lower turrets carried a triple-gun configuration, the first ever installed on an American battleship, bringing the ship's main battery to a total of 10 guns. The ship was so advanced that journalists quickly began calling the Nevada class the first true super dreadnought. Now, the only question was how far this new Titan could go in battle. 3 months after her commissioning, USS Nevada joined the ranks of the Atlantic Fleet in May 1916. America had not yet entered World War I, but with tensions rising by the day, every sailor aboard the battleship knew it was only a matter of time before their fleet was called to the front lines. Nevada made her way to Norfolk, Virginia, where she conducted endless exercises and spent weeks at sea during long-range patrols that carried her as far as the Caribbean and back. But for all this preparation, when the U.S. was finally dragged into the conflict in early 1917, USS Nevada suddenly found herself stuck on the sidelines. Her oil-fired power plant was designed to give her unprecedented endurance and independence at sea. Yet ironically, with oil supplies running dangerously low in Europe, it was these same power plants that kept her away from battle. Nevada and her crew had no choice, forced to continue training, waiting, and dreaming of the moment they would finally be allowed to join the fight. That day didn't arrive until August 1918, when Nevada was at last ordered to sail for Britain. By then, most of the naval action in World War I had already passed, and Nevada was relegated to convoy escort duty along the Irish coast. But for America's first super dreadnought, spending her debut war cruise babysitting supply ships was hardly the glorious role her crew expected. The war ended only 3 months after Nevada reached Britain, and although she returned to New York to parades and celebrations, some of her sailors likely stared past the cheering crowds, still wondering how the ship would have performed in a real battle. Soon enough, in late 1941, the United States had déjà vu. Halfway across the world, Europe was on the verge of collapse as Allied and Axis armies clashed in a struggle that threatened to engulf the entire planet. America was still skeptical about entering the conflict, but knowing that sooner or later it may have no choice, it had begun preparing. For USS Nevada, that meant that her main guns were granted an additional 30 degrees of elevation, extending their reach by more than 10,000 yards. For extra firepower, 8 5-inch anti-aircraft guns were installed along her decks. But not even with these upgrades was the ship truly ready to counter the threat moving toward her from the west. At around 8 a.m. on December 7th, while stationed in Pearl Harbor, the sky darkened with hundreds of Japanese aircraft descending toward Battleship Row. Bombs and torpedoes found their mark within minutes, tearing through steel hulls and extinguishing any hope of survival. There was little the ships could do except swing up every anti-aircraft gun they had and open fire, hoping that by some miracle their shots were able to break through the storm of attackers. Nevada, however, still had a fighting chance. She was the only battleship in port that wasn't moored at the time of the attack, and by pure luck, her crew had already lit a second boiler earlier that morning, giving the ship just enough power to get her moving. Sailors aboard probably didn't like the idea of fleeing the harbor and leaving their exposed companion ships behind. But as the crew witnessed USS Arizona, moored directly ahead of Nevada, being consumed by an explosion as a payload struck her, they understood there was nothing they could do. Nevada's only chance to survive was to leave the port. Nevada hadn't gotten far when a Japanese Nakajima B-5N bomber spotted her and released a single 18-inch aerial torpedo that smashed squarely into her hull. Fortunately for Nevada, engineers had upgraded her with a new set of anti-torpedo bulges. They couldn't stop all the flooding, but they absorbed enough of the blast to keep the battleship afloat. Nevada turned every anti-aircraft gun she had on the torpedo bomber that had just tried to claim her. Dozens of tracers cut through the smoke-filled sky, chasing the attacker until they finally tore into its fuselage. From the deck, sailors erupted in cheers as the Nakajima spiraled downward and vanished beneath the waves. But with only 2 boilers online and no tugboats ready to help her maneuver, Nevada could not come close to her maximum speed. It didn't take long before another Japanese aircraft descended toward the battleship. Gunners swung their weapons skyward and opened fire, but this time, luck was not on their side. Before they could take down the attacker, its bomb bay yawned open and released a payload that detonated directly over the ship's center. The blast was catastrophic, yet just as hope seemed to crumble on board Nevada, a thick cloud of smoke from burning ships along the harbor drifted over the water and swallowed her silhouette. Invisible to the circling attackers, Nevada pushed forward, gathering what little speed her damaged boilers could muster and charging toward the harbor entrance. But they were far from safe. A second wave of Japanese aircraft was approaching, and this time, their sights were fixed on a lone battleship attempting to escape the massacre. If Nevada went down there, her hull could block the harbor's only exit, trapping every surviving vessel behind her. As the bombs began to fall, that seemed to be exactly what was about to happen. 5 bombs smashed into her. Flames erupted instantly, devouring passageways and spitting smoke so thick that sailors could barely see, choking as they stumbled against each other. The crew knew Nevada was dying. Still, there was one final hope to save her, driving her into the shallow shoreline at Hospital Point, where perhaps she could be salvaged once the attack was over. With what little power remained, Nevada began the turn. Above her, Japanese bombers circled like vultures, seeking to feast on her carcass. But rather than give the enemy the satisfaction of watching her fall, Nevada's gunners raised their anti-aircraft weapons one last time and unleashed a barrage, bringing down more than one predator from the sky before they could make their final dives. Finally, at around 10:30 a.m., nearly 3 hours after the assault on Pearl Harbor had begun, USS Nevada made her way under the shallows at Hospital Point. By now, the Japanese had already withdrawn, but the crew on board the ship did not feel any sense of relief. 60 of her men were gone. Her hull was torn open, her machinery ruined, and her power gone. But she was not finished, and as long as she lived, she would not rest until she earned her revenge. Over 2 years had passed since the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, when Axis commanders received reports confirming their worst nightmare. The Allied forces, reinforced by hundreds of American warships, were sailing toward the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. The coasts were heavily reinforced by thousands of Nazi troops and non-German conscripts trained for static defense, armed with heavy artillery and anti-aircraft batteries, hidden behind concrete fortresses that seemed almost impenetrable. But as the U.S. fleet drew nearer, even the toughest of defenders felt a knot forming in his stomach. Perhaps the Japanese should have left America alone. To the west of the planned landing zone lay Utah Beach. Whoever controlled this stretch of sand gained near immediate access to the port of Cherbourg, at the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, the closest strategic harbor to Britain, and the key to supporting a constant stream of men and supplies into occupied Europe. The defenders understood that if their line cracked here, the Nazis might never recover. and so every soldier gripped his rifle. Every gun crew sighted their cannon toward sea and sky, everyone waiting for the final battle to begin. Then, a ship materialized through the haze on the horizon. A long battleship, its turrets stacked one atop another, in an outline that felt eerily familiar. Her silhouette had changed, the old twin mast replaced by a towering single-mast superstructure, large enough to resemble a medieval citadel from a distance. Her outdated secondary guns had been swapped for over a dozen modern dual-purpose 5-inch cannons mounted across 8 twin turrets. But even with these modifications, there was no mistaking the sea beast cutting through the waves toward France. USS Nevada was back in action. It had taken months of grueling rehabilitation to bring her back from the dead, months of upgrades, repairs, and cutting her teeth in operations from Alaska to the Atlantic. But now, at last, she was ready to stand toe-to-toe with the enemy, unleashing the full force of a naval powerhouse, 30 years in the making. The superguns of Nevada turned in unison and fired as one. Shells nearly 1,500 pounds heavy tore ahead, flying up to 20 miles before crashing into German coastal batteries and the reinforced seawall the defenders had built to stop the invading force. The blast sent entire portions of the wall crashing down, blowing open gaps wide enough for Allied tanks to push inland. But the enemy was not about to sit back and watch Nevada turn their defenses to ash. Before she could fire again, commanders across the shoreline ordered every available gun to lock onto the battleship. But even if the enemy had found the right range, not a single one of their shells struck home. And as long as Nevada remained afloat, she would keep firing back with maximum fury, sending out strikes that, unlike her enemies, didn't fail. Nevada continued supporting the Allied advance along the shores of France until late 1944. But as the new year rolled in, her bow turned once again toward the Pacific. American forces were closing in on the Japanese mainland, and now the Navy needed Nevada's unmatched firepower to break the last fortified strongholds. Much like the German defenders in France, Japanese commanders off the coast of Iwo Jima could barely hide their unease as Nevada's silhouette emerged on the horizon. They'd kicked the hornet's nest, and now they were going to feel the sting. Japanese gunners tried to take her down before she fired the first shot, but it was useless. Even while sailing as close as 600 yards from the island shore, not a single Japanese shell landed. Iwo Jima was still burning when Nevada closed in on her next target, Okinawa. There, she unleashed bombardments so intense that they felt like thunder exploding directly in the heart of Japanese lines. Japan knew the war was nearing its end, but still, the defenders believed they could deliver one final blow, one last act of vengeance against the ship that by all rights should have been wiped off the map all those years ago. A group of pilots climbed into their aircraft and took to the skies. Each man knew he would not be returning, yet they were ready to make the ultimate sacrifice if it meant destroying the warrior threatening their sacred homeland. Most were torn apart almost instantly, shredded midair by Nevada's anti-aircraft guns, or those of her escorting ships. But one aircraft, either through the skill of its pilots or pure dumb luck, managed to slip through the wall of fire. The aircraft slammed into the battleship's deck, obliterating 5 guns and claiming the lives of 11 men. A kamikaze strike was nothing for a ship that had already challenged death and won. Nevada's crew steadied their aim and fired once more. Japan was finished. The nation of the rising sun surrendered before USS Nevada could unleash her fury directly onto the Japanese mainland. But with her triumphs at Normandy, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa under her belt, she already stood among the most notable naval warriors America had commanded during the war. Yet despite her legendary service, commanders could not ignore that after more than 30 years of heavy duty, Nevada was past her prime. A new generation of battleships was rising, and there would be no place for her among them. So it was decided that her final mission would be an experimental one. USS Nevada was to sail to the Bikini Atoll on the Marshall Islands, where she would serve as a target for America's newest nuclear bombs to determine precisely what these weapons could do to a warship. To ensure she was unmistakable from the air, the entire hull was painted in a bright orange hue. Pilots circled above, locked onto the target, and released the bomb. And yet, almost inexplicably, the payload missed. A second nuclear weapon followed as part of the test series, but even as it detonated nearby with unimaginable force, Nevada refused to sink. Damaged, scorched, and blistered with radiation, she remained afloat. It would take an aerial torpedo, delivered 2 years later during a final live-fire exercise, to finally put the old warrior to rest. The Americans knew they had built a good ship. They never knew she was that good.